Hello and welcome to week 62 of our two-year Bible study. We're picking up where we left off last week in Second Chronicles chapter 29. We see in this chapter that Hezekiah purifies the temple. Now we know that Ahaz had shut the doors of the temple at least near the end of his reign, but he had filled the temple with all sorts of idolatrous material. Verses 16 and 17 of Second Chronicles chapter 29 tells us the priests went into the sanctuary of the Lord to purify it. They brought out to the courtyard of the Lord's temple everything unclean that they found in the temple of the Lord. Levites took it and carried it away to Kidron Valley, and they began the consecration on the first day of the first month, and by the eighth day of the month, they reached the portico of the Lord. So for 8 more days, they could consecrate the temple of the Lord itself, finishing on the 16th day of the first month. So it takes 8 days to remove all the idolatrous stuff that Ahaz had put into the temple, and then another 8 days in order to consecrate it. And so throughout the rest of this chapter, burnt offerings, purification offerings, peace sacrifices are all described so that there can be a purification of the temple. As we take a look at Psalm 48, although we don't know that this is a psalm written during this particular time, we do see that this is a psalm that talks about how those who are faithful to God, that God protects him. And the temple or the place of worship is very critical to that. So, for instance, in verse 9, it says, "Within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love." And thus why there cannot be other gods or other false idols that are in the temple, because it distracts us from meditating on the unfailing love of God. And that unfailing love of God is the protection of his people. As we return to Second Chronicles chapter 30, we see that Hezekiah celebrates the Passover. And Hezekiah is actually looking to reunite both the southern and northern kingdoms. Look at verse 1. Hezekiah sent word to all Israel and Judah, and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, inviting them to come to the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. So we do see that Hezekiah has a vision, at least, of trying to reunite um, Israel in worshiping. And then we see in verses 2 and 3, the king and his officials, the whole assembly, decide to celebrate. Verse 3, they had not been able to celebrate at the regular time because not enough priests had consecrated themselves, and the people had not assembled in Jerusalem. So this causes, obviously, a big problem, because if you don't have a consecrated priest, you can't sacrifice, or you can't worship properly for Passover. And in verse 18, we also see, although most of the main peoples who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun had not purified themselves, yet they ate in Passover contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, "May the Lord, who is good, pardon everyone who sets their heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, even if they are not clean according to the rules of the sanctuary." And so here again, as we've said before, we see that rules matter. So it's not as though the Mosaic law and the rules that God sets in Scripture don't matter, but relationship with God always is over the rules. And so the fact that there weren't consecrated priests did not stop them from celebrating Passover, because their hearts were in the right place. These people who had come to worship God from the northern kingdom, which had oftentimes been associated and characterized by severe amounts of idolatry, though they had not consecrated themselves, uh, Hezekiah asked for a pardon. And in verse 20, it says, "And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people." And so relationship with God always is over the rules. So the rules are important, but relationship is more important. As we get to Second Chronicles chapter 31, we see these contributions for worship that the people made. And really what we would in our modern day say is this is a revival among the people of Israel. And notice as you read through it that it's both the northern and the southern kingdoms that are contributing to God here. So we have this time of, it's a short period of time, but a time not where the kingdoms unify, but they are united, at least in their worship of God. And so this is kind of a really unique time frame during this particular period of Israel's history. Well, as we go back to Isaiah in chapter 28, we see that there's a continuation of the prophecies against the Israelites. Primarily taking a look at Ephraim and Judah here. And God says he's going to bring punishment on Ephraim for making his covenant only about rules. Notice in verse 10, it says, "For it is do this, do that, a rule for this, a rule for that, a little here, a little there." And they also make covenants with other gods. You see in verse 15, we have entered into a covenant with death. Um, and so God is going to bring punishment on Ephraim because they have minimized their relationship with God to just rules to be followed, and then in addition to that, have made covenants with other gods. And one of the primary ways that God is going to show his judgment on the people is in verse 11. It says, "Very well, then, with foreign lips and strange tongues, God will speak to his people." Um, and this is actually quite important because on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, we're going to see that one of the elements of Pentecost that caused people to the Jewish people who are listening to kind of take pause is because all of this statement about the gospel and what the people had done to Jesus and his crucifixion, his resurrection, was being spoken to them in foreign tongues. And so these foreign lips and strange tongues will God speaks to them through it. So this actually comes back up when we get to Acts chapter 2. And then the prophecy continues and says in verse 16, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. And one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. I will make justice to measure a line and righteousness to plumb line. Hail will sweep away your refuge to lie, and water will overflow your hiding place." So the Messiah is going to come, and when the Messiah comes, there will be punishment that comes along with it, but that punishment will eventually end. And so in verse 24, when a farmer plows for planting, how does he plow continually? Does he keep on breaking up and working the soil? When he has leveled the surface, does he not sow caraway and scatter cumin? Does he not plant wheat in its place? And so God is using this illustration of the farmer who plows up the ground. So God is bringing punishment, and yet in time he's going to plant so that there can be fruitfulness there. As we move into Isaiah chapter 29, we see a woe or a prophecy against Jerusalem. And he's going to bring judgment on her, it says in the first 8 verses, but also bring restoration to her. And again, this is a constant theme throughout the prophets where God says, because of your unfaithfulness to me, I'm going to bring punishment and judgment, but that punishment and judgment is intended to cause you to turn to me so that I can restore you, and I will restore you. And that's the common message that we see throughout the prophets. It says in verse 9 through 12 that there is going to be a time where there is going to be no revelation. And we see this come true actually between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew. There's 450 years of no time of revelation from God because his people do not come to him with their hearts. He says in verse 13, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught." And so we see that God has this deep desire to be in an intimate, vulnerable relationship with his people. Isaiah chapter 30 talks about, again, a prophecy against Judah, who's going to be punished, but again, is going to return to the Lord. Verse 31, or chapter 31, is a prophecy on all those who rely on Egypt. We see that the prophecy against Assyria that's in chapter 31 is actually going to come true in Isaiah's own book. Isaiah 36 and 37, when we get there, will show the fulfillment of the prophecies against Assyria that are in this chapter. As we move on to chapter 32, we see that we should be looking forward to a future time of righteousness. See, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. And so there's this looking forward um, to this king, this Messiah, who is going to rule and set everything right. Um, and so when we get to Isaiah chapter 33, and it talks about the woes against Jerusalem, the punishment that's going to come against Jerusalem. But again, we see that message of renewal, that God is going to renew Jerusalem despite the punishment. All of that suggests that at some point that the people that God is punishing will turn back to him. In chapter 34, we see a judgment against multiple different nations. Primarily, Edom is mentioned, and Edom is going to come under judgment. And actually, when you read through this particular chapter and recognize that Edom is represented by what is modern day Petra, if you've ever been to Petra, there's a lot of parallel between what God prophesies about Edom and what essentially the state of Petra is today. When we get to Isaiah chapter 35, we see that there is going to be this future time of joy, a day of the Lord's making of joy. And verses 5 and 6 say, then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, streams in the desert. This future day of joy began in Jesus' day. That's why Jesus is pointing to his miracles so often, not to point necessarily to his power, although that's certainly part of it, but to say the day of the Messiah has come. When I get to Isaiah chapter 36, this is a parallel with Sennacherib's threats to Jerusalem that we read about in our last session in 1 Kings chapter 18. And then in chapter 37, we see that that as Hezekiah is confronted with what Sennacherib is saying, in verse 14, it says, Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, and he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah here represents what we should do whenever we are overwhelmed. So Hezekiah is overwhelmed because of Sennacherib and his threats. And so he goes and puts all of this before the Lord. Interestingly, when you read through this particular chapter, and there are many different cities in this chapter that are mentioned, those are cities that are actually mentioned on what's called Sennacherib's prisms. And the prisms were recordings of the overthrowing of cities by Sennacherib. Jerusalem, so each city is mentioned, their God might be mentioned, and then it talks about how they've been overthrown. Jerusalem is mentioned on the prisms, but it does not say that it is conquered. And so this is all in fulfillment of what God was saying was going to happen to Assyria, and then becomes an establishment that we should trust him in terms of this Messiah, this king that he is going to send, which as we continue on in our reading in our next session and really throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we're going to see becomes more and more a focal point of our material.